Hi and welcome back. I hope you've voted appropriately. We now have a panel session, and that's your opportunity to ask questions from the floor. And then we're going to ask my DCE, my Deputy Chief Executive, Ingrid Haythorpe, to come up and launch the Network of Innovators, which I think will be of interest to all of you. So, and I'm finally, you can hear me now, it's working? Okay, great. I might start with, do we have any questions from the floor? Yes, you sir.
Question for Rachel. Can I be heard okay?
Yeah. There are some roving mics as well.
With the website, how do you prevent groups that develop a big following or a big participation base from garnering more support for their project and making sure theirs get funded, as opposed to a small outback community group that might have a better idea?
Yeah, and that's a concern that was raised when we started the design of this project. Before we actually even designed the tool or even thought about that, we actually went out to community groups and the public and said, what do we need to consider when we're designing this tool? And we had about 700 people take part in that conversation with us. And that is, addressing that concern is part of the reason that we included those 3 minimum criteria that I talked about. So a big organisation might have a big following, and so they might be able to bring hundreds of people into the tool, or potentially thousands. But because each person has to choose different projects and meet that minimum criteria, what we found is that people will come into the tool, and they might come into the tool through a particular project's page because people can use their URL and post that out. But when we looked at the data, we found that people might be entering through a particular project, but they're not necessarily supporting that project. They're actually looking at all the projects that are out there and making a decision based on that. And that's why I said the correlation between a person's affiliation with an organisation and supporting the project of that organisation is very weak.
Great. Yes.
Thanks for your presentations, and yours blew my mind. It was fantastic, and I was particularly interested in this idea of
Can we get the mic? Sorry, just hang on for a moment so people can hear. Thank you. Perhaps repeat the question.
I was just thanking people for their presentations, in particular Pia's, and the notion that it's time to uncouple democracy from territoriality, which I think is a really fantastic thing to ponder. And I was struck by the contrast between that and the Your Say website, which invites you to participate in consultations based on your postcode, and curious about things, for example, perhaps as a South Australian who feels very connected to the Flinders Ranges despite the fact that I live in Adelaide, I might wish to have a say in the, I might think that that's part of what I'd like to have a say on, bushfire management in the Flinders. And I was wondering about the contrast between those two approaches, and if somebody had a comment or would like to expand on that.
I might just address the part about the postcode and when you register. That's just one example of the information we ask when you register. So the Your Say website is constantly evolving and building more functionality into it. We ask when you register, and we don't want to ask too much information of people when they register, because we really want people to come and experience what it's like. So we'll ask your postcode, we'll ask your gender and your age, but also what you're interested in. So there's a range, I think there's 10 different topics that we ask, what area of interest do you want to be involved in? And so that's another way of capturing people's interests, so that we can then let them know, if you're interested in the environment, then you can tick that box, and when there's an environment either initiative or a consultation, then we'll aim to let you know when that comes online. So we're sort of always building that capability as well.
Yeah, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, I mean, I think that there are different levels, and maybe they're not sort of mutually exclusive either. Maybe at hyper-local government, it just makes sense just to keep some sort of territorial idea, maybe providing that you can clearly have a say on issues that you're interested in. And then at a much more sort of hyper-global level, we can have this idea that our democratic engagement shouldn't be tied up to the territory that we happen to be living in, especially in a world that that problems are increasingly affecting us all. Like, and even if you think about it, the election in the United States now, the fact that maybe someone like Trump, that hopefully won't happen, but maybe someone like Trump is president, like, it affects the whole world, you know, not just the US. So like starting to sort of uncouple that, I think it's, yeah.
Great response. Yes. David?
Hi, thanks. Shari, I had a question for you about participatory budgeting, or a couple of questions actually. One of the things I found out about here at participatory budgeting was a bit of an unknown benefit of it, was that it was incredibly more efficient to run. And I just wanted to check, so if government runs the grant process, it's, you know, there's a lot of time and effort put into that, whereas because the citizens are deciding you don't need all that time and effort, so you can reinvest the money into the actual purpose of the fund rather than administering it. So is that experience replicated from where you're in your experience as well? First question. Second question was, have you had experience where non-government actors have done this PB, and how was that? What were some of the tricks in getting that to be successful?
So I'm going to do my best to remember all of the questions. But this idea of kind of around the cost of participatory budgeting and how that gets absorbed. So a lot of our model at PBP, the Participatory Budgeting Project, is we're a technical assistance provider. And in the first year that we did participatory budgeting in Boston, there was a contract that was written between PBP and the city of Boston. And over time, that contract became smaller because we really started to figure out how to institutionalize this process and how to share responsibilities within government staff so that it could continue to happen and so that we didn't have to have a larger contract. And so that contract got smaller over time. And that's the model of PBP doing participatory budgeting across the country, because the hope is that it's not just this organization, but that it's really an institutionalized process that changes how government functions. So I think that's the larger goal. And then I told you I was going to try and remember your second question, but I'm struggling a bit. Can you remind me? Yes. Absolutely. So it's kind of like, how does participatory budgeting happen? Is it grassroots or community-based organizations that push this, or does it start as a brainchild of an elected official? And it happens in both ways, and I've seen many examples of it happening in both ways, where community organizing groups are saying, this is something that we really want, but ultimately, there has to be some government official or entity that is willing to put a pot of money up so that community can collaborate together. So it can happen on either end, but the most important piece here, though, is collaboration.
Thank you. And we have a question in the front.
I'm just wondering what scope any of you have for outrageous ideas that do not necessarily attract a significant number of supporters. For instance, I've been working in addiction recovery for 30 years. The first thing I would like to see happen is for the women's shelters to be closed, so that, and instead, at less expense, those people who are troubled by their addiction, alcohol, drugs, sex, rock and roll, whichever one, would be detained in a locked facility where they can undergo meditation on the possibility of recovering. It offends me, actually, that word just popped out. It offends me that little children are taken out of their homes with their mothers, or could be fathers, or make it fathers now because the poor old men are having a bad time. Just lately, one of my neighbours who is a serious alcoholic, nothing worked for him until he's now in a locked situation with serious dementia. If he'd been picked up years ago, he needn't have got to this stage. Now, where would you put that sort of appeal? Because I don't think anyone apart from me is keen to close the women's shelters.
So I might just paraphrase your question. And I think that, yeah, I think if you're asking what capacity, and I might just handle that question. If, you know, one of the things that I think is important when we involve the community is that we're clear about what the parameters are. So it's really important not to involve people in decisions that are either already made or where there's no scope for the community to influence the decision making. So sometimes there might be ideas that are perhaps unrealistic, or they might be so far out on left field or right field that they're not going to have any traction. Those ideas can come through any kind of through traditional processes, but I think as a government and as people involving in the community, we need to be quite explicit about what the scope of influence that the community is able to have. Thank you very much. We might take the next question.
Thank you. My name's Fuzzy Trojan, and thanks for stimulating my brain cells this morning. Most of you are focused on improving the decision-making process by involving ordinary citizens. I'm also interested in the top end, and if you have any comments on this question, how can we make the current structure of government less adversarial and more cooperative?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to look at this, but one is to be able to point to examples of success. And so, for example, when we talk about PB in the United States, a question that I get often is how do we convince an elected official to do something like this, right? Because they have to acknowledge some vulnerability, right? They have to say, well, not only do we want to hear from community, but we also need to acknowledge that maybe there's a better way of doing this. And so that's something that we run up against quite a bit and can be very, very challenging and sometimes divisive. But I think it's coming to this work and thinking about research ahead of time so that you're able to point to some data and data points, but also to have some champions of this in government that can say, this has been my experience and this is why it was beneficial for me on the top end, right? And then also have that same conversation for folks that are throughout the process in different stages.
What we did was when we first started working with Democracy OS and these decision-making platforms, and we tried to convince political parties to, especially political parties in government, to take them on, and we had a very hard time doing it. Challenges it's an understatement. And so what we did was we did this political party ourselves and ran for elections, and it was a way of saying, look, we know we're going to have to sort of play by the rules of the game, but we want to propose something so radically different in this environment. And by gaining some votes and tractions in their own sort of arena, in their own field, I think we did do a lot of progress. And then they ended up adopting this tool at a Congress level, probably because of that. I'm not suggesting you go ahead and do a political party, but I'm just saying like there are sort of different strategies.
I'll take the next question. Thank you. Thanks.
Hello. Hi, Pia, Sharia, and all those who are coming from so far away. Welcome to South Australia first, and congratulations. Your presentation was really excellent. The question that I wish to ask you is very short and simple. I hope you have met our Premier and our South Australian government, bureaucrats and other chief executives. So in context to South Australia, and Pia, you were saying that political models, we have to find an alternative political model. So do you think the Premier or our South Australian government is approaching, or they want you to give any proposal or any idea that you have how we should, like after this open state program, South Australia wants change, right? But we are very conservative state. There are lots of people who don't want to change the way they do the business or the way they work. So are you being given any proposal by South Australian government or Sharia when you will go back to US? Do you have to work on any project that will help South Australia, or how to create an alternative political model. Any thoughts or any suggestions or discussions you have with any of the political party people, ministers, or etc.?
You want the inside scoop. At least on my end, the answer is yes. We've been having a lot of some conversations about what pilots we can run with some new and like tools like Democracy Earth, but also rethinking sort of how we can support the citizen juries, and Gail might kill me if I say that, but no, it's fine. So support the citizen juries with some liquid democracy pilots that we want to run. So yeah, no, definitely super receptive.
And to add to that, I think open state is certainly not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning, and I think that's the point of all of us coming together in this 10-day-long experience where we're bringing people from all over the world to do exactly what you're describing and to make South Australia better, but also to make communities across the globe better.
Michael, the back.
Thank you. A very thought-provoking morning. One of the thoughts I had as you were talking, Shari, is what is the essential difference between a participatory budgeting process and just a straight-out grants process? And I think you kind of answered that along the way, and Rachel followed that really well. What I'm wondering, though, is whether perhaps some of the magic of participatory budgeting is actually in that organic facilitation of ideas, wrestling those thousands of ideas, as you mentioned, into something that is digestible and votable by the community. I'm a big fan of Fund My Idea, but it relies on organisations or groups to come together and sort of do their ideas in isolation. And your video and your talk made me think that with the hundreds, if not thousands of volunteers and that face time spent building ideas up, so starting perhaps with a bacon room and ending up with something that's actually doable. Any comments from either, and Gail, you might like to get involved, about how we might bring that component of participatory budgeting into the tools we've already got in South Australia?
Well, I think one key component here is when you suggest an idea, right? Anyone from anywhere in the world can suggest an idea. And when these change agents come together to work on these things, they're often in committees that have nothing to do with the original idea that they suggested. And there's been some anecdotal stories, but also a bit of research on this element too, of folks that have come to the table with a very specific idea and entry point, and we've discussed this earlier, but ending up in a different space, and I think Rachel talked about that, is maybe you are coming into this work with a very specific goal in mind, but you're being opened up to different ideas and having an opportunity to learn about different facets of government and how to navigate those and what purchasing looks like. And I'll just give a really, really quick example. So one of the projects that made it onto the ballot and was voted on and was implemented was a park renovation. And we were getting ready to break ground and do this park renovation, and we had to stop, right, all construction because we found out that this park was on top of an archaeological site. So we stopped, and all of community came together to do this archaeological dig, and we actually extended Boston's history because we actually found artifacts and then did the park renovation. So it was a huge opportunity in learning. And so I mentioned before, participatory budgeting may be dollars and cents, but it's more than that. It's changing the narrative, and it's this two-directional learning opportunity that takes place that's really based in collaboration. And so folks don't know what to expect when they walk in, but they leave with tons of new skill sets and a deeper appreciation and understanding of government, but also community.
And I might add to that. Fund My Community was an existing grant program that we applied a new approach to, and so there were some certain parameters already existing that we had to abide by. And one of those was that the funding can only go to not-for-profit incorporated organisations. It can't go to members of the community. It can't go to unincorporated groups of community members, and that's legislative. That's how the funding itself is legislated. So that's some parameters that we had to deal with. Fund My Idea, on the other hand, I think is more of the model that you're talking about, and that's the participatory budgeting program that we do in regional areas as part of country cabinets. With that, any member of the community can come up with an idea and submit it through the tool, and then all community are invited to vote on those ideas. So we're using two different models, applying it slightly differently, but trialing both.
And I think that's the thing. It is a trial, but like any good engagement process, you can't just take a set model and apply it. And I think you need to be understanding the conditions on the ground, and in doing that, involve people in designing what you're hoping to achieve. So you might end up with, so for example, Fund My Community is one model of participatory budgeting. There are a whole range of other kinds of models that include a much more deliberative piece face-to-face, whereas Fund My Community is aiming to take that to scale, to involve large numbers of people. But depending on what your objectives are, you should design your processes with the people that are going to be involved, and then you'll get a model that actually works to bring the right people into the right conversation at the right time. And I think that, a hybrid, I could see us, in future coming up with a bit of a hybrid between a citizens' jury and a participatory budgeting exercise. The reason I like PB is that it makes the commitment up the front. Quite often, as a person who's involved in engagement, we go out, we engage with the community. Community has different expectations. Government resources can't match those expectations. That's not a reason to do engagement, not to do engagement. But the reason I like participatory budgeting is that we're explicit about our commitment up front. Here's the money, here's the quantum, and you're not retrofitting along back down the process, which I think can be challenging for public servants, trying to be true to what they hear from the community, but also then take it back into a system that isn't perhaps built for that kind of input. Sorry, your question.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I know them. What was the question? Yeah, totally. So they build. I don't know if they released it already, but they have a platform on with Liquid Democracy. I don't know how they did in the elections though. Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a way of starting. It's what I was saying just now about building a political party. It's like anything that we can to put our agenda on, sort of bring our agenda to the mainstream, and also think outside of the traditional sort of ways of engaging in politics. I think that's, at least in my experience, what's most interesting as well. This is very hard, right? Because what the political system expects of us in order to really be part of those sort of decision spaces is like to dedicate our life to politics, right? And run for elections and be part of a party, and then slowly start sort of making your way up. And I think that excludes the vast majority of us, that we might not want that, but we still want a seat at the table. And so parties like this that are, through running for elections with quite an innovative idea are making us have this conversation.
So it's interesting how they're doing it within the existing political system rather than trying to change.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Everything that I think that at least the way I see part of what I do and why I'm so passionate about it is trying to push the boundaries of what's perceived as doable in politics. I think that's something that and these kind of parties are also doing that, right? By suddenly, the first time they run, they're the absolute crazy ones. The second time, they're a little less crazy. And then, slowly but surely, we're starting to build this idea that we can crystallize this idea that doing these things is not, impossible.
Have we got a mic? Thanks, Alison.
Thank you so much for excellent presentations. Pia, the things that you talked about, I just had a very spirited discussion just last week with some friends online about this very thing, and they called me crazy as well, so don't worry, we're related, it's
Welcome
fine.
to the club.
what I really liked about the liquid democracy that you talked about was that it sort of both democratises and legitimises expertise at the same time. And I think that's been an interesting development in the sort of move towards collaboration and broader collaboration, is that expertise is almost losing its legitimacy and foothold in lots of ways. What I'm interested in, you've all touched on the benefits of these participatory type processes, whether they be around decision making or budgeting or you know, variants of all of those things. And there's obviously a huge amount of education that happens for the people who are involved, and they learn a lot as part of the process and are you know, increasingly able to engage, which is fantastic. In your experience or observation, how much education do they need before they go into these processes? Are they sort of, do people take to them quite intuitively, or do you find that they really go in very green, very unfamiliar, and you have to invest a lot of time up front in the educative component before you can get down to wrestling the big ideas?
Well, I think there's a couple things to think about. Absolutely, there are no requirements to participation, and that we're talking about reducing barriers to engagement, right? So there can't be requirements to participation. With that being said, though, there has to be some major intention, I think you're getting at this, around material development, but also what facilitation looks like in these spaces. And so in order to create a design where folks are able to understand the material that we're talking about, their materials have to be developed in order to do that. And then again, if we're thinking about folks with various skill sets and levels of education, especially when we're talking about children, right? A 13-year-old in the same room as a 22-year-old, and how they feel safe and comfortable stepping up to the microphone, for example, really has to do with facilitation and facilitators with a diverse skill set, and there has to be some intentionality around that. The last thing I'll say is, when we talk about education and material design specifically, I think it is paramount that the people that we're trying to reach are involved in the design of those items. So if I'm choosing words, right, that may or may not resonate with folks, that's not very helpful. That has to be vetted by community, and I think that's a really important component. If folks are saying, when should we involve community or when should we involve youth, the likelihood is that you've waited too long.
You sort of just touched on my question a little bit, but I wanted to explore it a little bit further with all of you and your initiatives. I think with customer and community engagement, often people's biggest concern is reach and gaining participation. And I was wondering if you have any tips on each of your initiatives on how you gained reach and engagement in your activities.
Sarah, did you want to respond to that?
I can talk about some of the strategies and tactics that we employ with the Your Say website. We have, for many years, focused on building a really strong social media presence. So we have a Facebook page, a Twitter account, we have a LinkedIn presence, and we also have an Instagram account. So we've got a number of channels into the community in the online space, but using social media. So social media has changed over the years, and you no longer have a page where you have 100 followers and every time you post on that Facebook page everybody gets an update. Things have evolved, so you actually need to use those channels much more as a broadcast channel and like an advertising platform now. You actually need to pay to go out and find communities, but we've embraced that and flipped it on its head and thought, okay, well, we happen to have an engagement now on the site that's around bushfire management in the Flinders Ranges. So let's create a post on the Facebook page, and we'll put and it's small amounts of money, it's $5, $10 that you can reach a lot of people on Facebook. Put a little bit of money towards that post and tell Facebook that we would like them to notify people who are interested in the Flinders Ranges, in tourism, in that particular area, in bushwalking, in camping, and then go out and reach that audience using that platform, because it's very highly sophisticated and very, very targeted. So we'll do that to go out and increase reach, and we do that around a whole range of things, whether they be geographic or interest-based, to go out and fish where the fish are in the online space.
Thank you. Great question. Was anyone else want to say anything about that?
So with Fund My Community, we've also flipped around the traditional comms role of government. In the first year, we took an ad in the Sunday Mail and we thought this is great, it's going to bring lots of people in. Then when we did our user survey, asking people how they found the site and where they came from, we found less than 10% of people came from that advertisement. The majority of people came through the networks of networks approach, so organisations that had applied were telling their networks, and those people that received that were then telling their networks, and so we broadcast that way. So now for the second round, we completely flipped our comms and we invest in the applicant organisations now. We provide them with the skills, we provide workshops, we produce material that is for them to then use out to their networks. So the government, we're actually building the capacity of our applicant organisations to do their marketing, to do online marketing. And yeah, that's really increased our reach.
To add on to that, you know, to be honest, there's no shortcut to effective outreach, and it's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. And so this notion of getting the folks that you're really trying to reach involved in that process is really important. And I'll be honest about this too. The first time that I walked into a community center and said, I have $1 million and I want you guys to tell me how to spend it, keeping in mind, I know a lot of people in Boston. My expertise is really around youth engagement. They said, yeah, right, we don't believe you. And we also don't believe that the money that you're talking about is going to be spent in my community. It's going to be spent in some well-off area of Boston. And so it was really having those tough and vulnerable conversations, and I don't think that we can gloss over that part of it, right? I think we have to be honest that this is work, but it's work that's important, it's work that's essential, and it's work that we learn from, and there are local champions that you can lean on, but local champions don't just knock on your door, right? There's some effort that has to happen for a design that is welcoming and inviting, but also very real. And I think that folks are so often uncomfortable sitting in discomfort. There is such a thing as healthy tension, and we have to apply a trauma-informed model to this sort of work as well.
Wendy.
Thanks, thanks very much for a great session, everyone. My question follows on from Pia's comment about pushing boundaries. So I'm wondering to what extent some of these new models are complementary and sort of enhance existing representative democracy, and to what extent are they fundamentally disruptive? And in fact, following on from some of the comments that Simon made at IOP2 last week, is it disruption that we're actually looking for?
Look, I think that at least in my mind, sort of the winning strategy is, and I shift this in my sort of in my work, and I changed the way I looked at this, but it has to do with this building an alternative, and that it might coexist. And I think that with every new paradigm that emerges and another one that decays, they're forced to coexist in time. It's not a clear-cut sort of one thing or the other one. I think that thinking that nation states are going to disappear and that the internet is going to be the only sort of sovereign jurisdiction, I think it doesn't make a lot of sense. And pushing for something like that, I think that more than disruptive would be quite chaotic. So I think that allowing for two models to coexist and building alternatives and bringing people to one alternative to your idea, and then but also building bridges for people who are involved in the current way of doing things to be able to also sort of shift towards new ways. I think it's the peaceful strategy here, and it's the one I would advocate for. Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting to have people like Pia come out here and expand our horizons about what might be possible, and then for those of us who work within systems and organisations to say, well, how might we develop something that is uniquely South Australian, that is new and innovative and different, and that draws from the kind of thinking that we've been hearing about today and uses some of those tools and actually does something that is perhaps, South Australians' version thereof, and it might well be a hybrid. Yep, question?
Look, I'd like to go back to democracy and look at it with a real situation that's happening here in South Australia. Not loud enough?
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry. We've got a citizens jury here sitting on, at the moment sitting, which is on the nuclear question, whether Australia becomes a waste dump for the whole rest of the world. The government does not have to abide by the decision of the jury. It is actually very selective in the information it's actually giving to people, allowing them to get. I know the Con Council refused twice. The Doctors Against Medical Association for Prevention of War are not allowed to give evidence. And the Greens, who have a lot of scientific evidence, aren't even sure when or how many people they'll be allowed to address. So the government's also announced that it wants to, the Premier, that I want to go ahead with this thing as soon as possible, even though the jury hasn't sat. So in this situation, and young people aren't interested. There's very few young people even interested in the issue because they feel so cynical about government. So, like, to me, it's a really real situation at the moment. I wondered if you could comment on this, because it ticks all the boxes when you go through everything. But the amount of money being spent on the pro side is phenomenal, and the other people that aren't even allowed to give evidence. So.
Really good question. Look, I think one of the things that we've done in our area's design models, which use participatory mechanisms and then build them, design them, and then transition them to other organisations or other parts of government. And that is in fact the case that's happened with the citizens' jury. So we've done a couple within our team, trialled the model. We also, we did that for Safe and Vibrant Adelaide, we did for cycling, and then we helped Duna do their animal management citizens jury. The role in which our team's taken in designing the process for the engagement around nuclear has been largely in the deliberative space. So that first jury decided what the community should hear about, and that was put out in a document. There was then a broad-scale community conversation which involved people in shopping centres. That process was run by CARA, which is the office which is looking after this engagement process. And that broad community engagement process and community information process will culminate in, and in fact is culminating in, a citizens' jury of about 350 people who have gathered, I think, once already at the convention centre and will go through a deliberative process. I think it's interesting because for those of you who don't know about juries, juries are representative, not in the sense that we nominate a representative to that process, but through the process of random selection. Through Australia Post, invitations are sent out to the community and the community responds back, and then those invitations are stratified according to gender, postcode, age, and so that the makeup of the jury reflects the demography of South Australia. It's matched to the census data. So that jury is considering the evidence. It is really important that that is a process with high integrity, particularly that jury process. As I understand it, they're considering 3 options, and I don't have the exact detail of what those options are with me, so I don't want to misinform. That's okay. Oh, okay. But that jury will make recommendations. 350 people will go through a process of reviewing the evidence, and they are able to call their own witnesses. And I think that's a particularly important part of having integrity in that process. Is that right? You are able to call your own witnesses, some of your own witnesses. Okay. And once that jury has considered all the evidence and deliberated, it will put a report to government. Now, government doesn't have to accept the recommendations of the jury, but I think it would be a very unwise government, and I think the Premier said this, that convenes such a process, convenes such a large-scale jury, and then disregards the recommendations. So they will certainly inform the government's decision making. But the other thing that the Premier has said, and he's been quite explicit about this, is that there will be a process where we look to establish whether there is social community consent for a jury, for a nuclear waste repository. But ultimately the decision will rest with government. And I think being explicit and clear up front about that is about being genuine, and that's what we ask government to do, to be clear about what its promise to community is. So I'm watching with interest, and I think that it's a really important decision for our state. And we have yet to see the outcomes of the jury, and I'd ask you to reserve your judgment. I have faith in the community coming up with the right decision. I trust those processes, and I also happen to trust the people running that process, which is a company called Democracy Co. And they have a particular commitment to democratic practice, and their business model is completely disrupted if they allow that process to be perverted. So we wait and see, and thank you for your question. Moving on. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you. I don't want to harsh the vibe or anything, but it seems to me that each of the areas that you guys are working in has pretty entrenched opposition. So whether that might be a local member or something who doesn't quite get the idea, right the way up to nation states or political parties who want to maintain their monopoly on political power. So I just wonder whether you guys could perhaps think of an example where you've been able to subvert or work around or somehow overcome the sorts of obstructions that you've faced, so that when we may face those sorts of obstructions as well, we've got some tools in our kit to be able to overcome them as well.
Well, I think one component is when we find opposition, it's the natural reaction is to try to go the other direction or subvert it, like you said. But I think a part of the real solution, especially when we talk about democracy, is welcoming those folks into the fold. And I think that's how you address that. It can't be real democracy if we're excluding people that initially disagree.
I guess coming from a Fund My Community example, the initial program was actually a trial. The government wanted to try and see how this would be. And part of that trial was the commitment that we would evaluate it and we would test it and see what the outcome was. And we've been very open and transparent with those findings. They're on the website. People can go and read them. We've included the positives that we found, but also we highlighted the lessons that we learned so that other people that might want to try and use this approach can actually think about that in their design. And I think that's really important, being quite honest with our learnings as we go through the processes.
A good example maybe can be the Creative Commons example, right? So the copyleft movement, they were fighting against one of the most entrenched powers, right? The copyright. And so after battling them for a while, they decided to create Creative Commons copyleft licensing. And so they said, you know what? We don't care. You can keep your own sort of way of doing things. We're just going to have this licensing system, and we're just going to welcome anyone who wants to start using it. And that's pretty much how open source now works. And it's a huge, huge and growing sort of system. So really thinking about the tools that you have in terms of how you can, again, sort of do things in a different way and welcome others to join you in that way of doing it. I think if there's something that we really learned from the internet, is this idea of permissionless innovation, right? Not ask for permission, just use the tools that we have to just build it.
So can I tell my manager that?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you my email, you can give it to them.
Look, I think demonstrating success and doing projects, quite often people within government are not, they're not necessarily opposed, but they don't necessarily know what to do. So this thing called engagement, open innovation, democratic reform, what is this thing? So build the capacity through things like the Better Together program, encourage people to attend the training. And then when you are going to do a project, to secure a mandate for it, and that mandate needs to be a senior person, a senior decision maker. We're very fortunate in the state that the Premier has lent his mandate to this, and there's a policy statement in place. Reforming Democracy outlines a commitment to doing this work, and we're taking it quite seriously. So under cover of that policy, under cover of that remit, find your own personal champion within your space, engage them in the work, and then when you do your demonstration pilot project, make sure that you actually measure, that you quantify, that you get the engagement. And you won't always succeed. I mean, that's the whole point of doing this, is sometimes things don't work. But, and then enter awards when it does work, so that you get the recognition back in. We've got time for one more question.
So my question is for Pia, and it's considering the historical and current apathy in politics, what do you think is the biggest challenge we face in awakening the global citizen out of the learned or programmed dependency on the patriarchal political model?
Chan.
And the second part is...
More. Oh my God.
How can we address this challenge to empower and motivate? And I ask this because I'm from a third world country, Venezuela, and you would be very familiar with the situation there, because it's very similar to the one in Argentina.
Yeah. So how do we do it? I think that I think the tools are there. So the first thing I'd like to challenge is the idea that we are apathetic. I don't agree with that, in the sense that I think that I'm going to put myself in the sort of millennial sort of generation just because I can. I think that what we don't, it's horrible speaking of in the name of, but sort of I think that the channels in which we can engage are not the ones that we like to engage with. So I think the problem is not that our generation is apathetic. I think that millennials in particular are very committed to a lot of causes and a lot of projects and communities. They are just not the ones, or not in the way that the current sort of institutions expect them to participate. So voter turnout is obviously very low because it's on a Tuesday, and that's just sort of an example. I think that today we have the tools to build pretty much anything we want, and it was like, and it's sort of a bit what I'm going on and about. We can use the internet to create, to mobilize and to communicate in ways that we couldn't do before. We can fund now those activities using cryptocurrencies. We have more and more cryptographic tools to make sure that governments like the one in Venezuela or the one in Turkey, or they're not sort of surveilling activists. So I think that the tools are there, that the tools that we have now allow for innovation to be pushed to the fringes. I think that the cost of changing and experimenting in politics now it's very high, but in sort of using these tools and in online communities it's not high at all. Like, it's actually very, very, very low to pilot and experiment and organize. And I think that what we've seen with the Green Revolution in Iran and the Arab Spring, the Chilean students, the Wikipolitica in Mexico, the Yo Soy 132, the dissidents in Venezuela, Julio Coco, and all sort of that group, what we are doing in Argentina. But I think that there are expressions of like a global youth that it's really taking on these tools to organizing. And you know what, to challenge power from outside political institutions. And I think that in Latin America in particular, because the type of democracies that we have, that are democracies that are not, if you want, finished in a certain way, they're not real democracies, then we've engaged, we've been able to have a conversation of power, with power from outside the political, the fringes of the political institutions. And that's extremely inspiring. So showcasing more of these examples and supporting them, I think, yeah, it would really go. I'm an optimist. I will die an optimist, that's for sure. So, yeah.
I think that's probably it for questions. Before I ask you to thank the panel, I'm just going to flag that there's one more thing that we're going to share with you today. So on behalf of South Australia, thank you very much for coming. Thank you.